Well, good evening there. Welcome back to the first episode of Season 3 of DeBakey CV Live, Innovation on the Loose. Streaming live from Houston Methodist Hospital here in the Texas Medical Center. I'm Dr. Stuart Corr, Director of Innovation Engineering for the DeBakey Heart and Vascular Center. And tonight I'm absolutely delighted to have on the show Joshua Mecca, CEO and founder of M&S Biotics, and Drew Hendricks, Director of Clinical Operations for M&S Biotics. They're here tonight to discuss a novel system for tracking intraoperative analytics and surgical behaviour in the operating room. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to invite the audience into our discussions, so please submit your questions via web at polev.com using DeBakey as the username, or text DeBakey to 37607 alongside your question. And you can also add your question into the live YouTube stream. And just before I cut to our guests, I'd just like to bring to your attention a special symposium that we have coming up on October the 4th. As you can see from my slides here, this is the second annual symposium of the Houston Methodist Institute for Robotics, Imaging and Navigation, or as we refer to it as MIRN. Now, if you want to register for this symposium, you can go to mirin22.info, and you can see here all our participants. And we are basically going to disseminate advancements in the fields of surgical robotics, extended reality, and image-guided navigation. So please register there. And now over to my special guests. I'd like to introduce Joshua Mecca, CEO of M&S Biotics. Josh, welcome to the show.
Hey, Stu. Thank you so much for having me. Let me get up and get the presentation on. Can everybody see it? Excellent. Before I get started, I always like to explain how this company came to be. August 2013, I had a kidney transplant. But it was in going through a kidney transplant that it really opened my eyes to a lot of the bottlenecks that are inside the operating room. And very fortunately, I came out of that procedure for the better. But it still reminded me of what could be improved. And what that led me to do is create a company to address those bottlenecks inside the operating room. And what I'd like to say is, if I can encapsulate all the anxiety that leads up to a procedure of that magnitude and put it in one picture, it looked like this. This is a retained surgical item left behind at the conclusion of a procedure. Now, luckily, it does happen rarely, but it does happen. And the only way to prevent it right now is by manually counting surgical items one by one before, during, and after each procedure. And what's that mean for the patient? Well, for starters, 14% of operative time is spent counting surgical sponges alone. None of the metal instruments, just sponges. And because of the human element in the process, 1 in 8 surgeries have a counting discrepancy. Now, that doesn't mean that item is left in the patient, they just can't account for it. So that typically leads to more time in the operating room and more risk for a patient like myself trying to reconcile those counts and identify where this missing item might be. But what if you could automate that process? Well, if you could, and you could remove minimally 15 minutes per procedure at $75 a minute, you could save a hospital up to $170,000 in 1 week from just this one issue. But it's only half the problem. The other half is that less than 20% of the instruments brought into the operating room are utilized during the course of that procedure. They still have to be cleaned, they still have to be sterilized, they have to be reprocessed, but they're not used. And studies gone on to show that if you could reduce complex instrument sets by 70%, you could save a hospital up to $2.8 million in 1 year just from better resource management alone. So how are we solving this? We're solving this problem by introducing one of the first autonomous RF solutions to the operating room. Now, what I mean by autonomous is it doesn't require any manual effort, nor does it disrupt the current workflow of the operating room. And that's key, because that's a major distraction or major detraction from what's currently available on the market today. This system gives us the ability to detect, track, count, and locate surgical items inside the operating room in real time and transmit that information wirelessly to a medical grade tablet or a monitor in the room so that staff could identify all the items at any given time during that procedure. That effectively automates the surgical counting process. But that's only half of what it does. Because this system's autonomous, it allows us to collect data points such as which instrument's being used, not being used, how long it's being used for. And we take those data points and we apply them to machine learning algorithms in order to produce downstream analytics. These analytics allow us to optimize surgical sets by surgeon and by case, which reduce the amount of volume going into the operating room in the first place. This is a tested and proven product, and this is an MVP picture, minimal viable product, that's showing the system reading 250 random orthopedic instruments in 20 seconds. And it's also showing, out of 150 items, 10 being removed from the table, and being able to identify which 10 have been removed from the table and for how long. And how are we ultimately doing this? Well, in 2016, the FDA came out and said all items need to be uniquely identifiable in healthcare. It was a major rollout. And RFID technology has really been filling that gap, specifically because of these RFID tags. These are ceramic-based tags. They're commercially off the shelf. There's many vendors for them, and they're currently in use today. And the way they could be affixed to these instruments, they could be embedded at the point of manufacturing, or retrofitted by using an FDA-approved and cleared epoxy and adhesive mixture. And these mixtures survive the autoclave cycle for up to 100 autoclaves, and sometimes 6 times the survivability rate of the instrument. So what does that mean? The instrument is more likely to fail than the tag is to fall off. But here's some videos to kind of give you an idea of how this system fits into the workflow in the operating room. As you can see here, it's replacing your current back table. It's against the wall. You're going to interact with it like you would any other back table, pulling the instrumentation out, prepping the back table so it's most easily accessible for the surgical technician. And one of the big things is we were the first US-based company to partner with Johnson & Johnson's Center for Device Innovation, and we displayed this minimal viable technology to them through a 7-step protocol in which we demonstrated the feasibility and the viability of what we were trying to do. And what you could see from this video is I'm just going to remove the sound here. We're stacking this table with 300 instruments, huge volume. Traditionally, current RFID enabled systems in the operating room, you have to scan this stuff one by one. The reason for it, as a lot of instruments are in close proximity, there's a ton of interference. Now, interference leads to inaccurate reads. We developed a system to be able to bypass that. It produces a RFID field where we could capture 99.9% of the instrumentation or surgical items that are placed on this table. And what you're seeing me is sitting down, and in this picture-in-picture show, I'm picking the surgeon, the procedure, and I'm hitting start. And what you're looking for here is all the instrumentation that's on here will be registered and populated in this list. So within 8 seconds, we pull in 298 instruments out of the 300, and within less than 10 seconds later, we pull all 300 instruments onto this table, which expedites the counting process by 99% for this instance. And what I'd like to do at this moment is, one of the proudest things M&S Biotics has been able to do is publish a journal article in the IEEE. And I want to turn it over to the first author so he could give you his experiences and share a little bit more of how that study was run and ultimately the data that we retrieved from it. So Drew, take it away for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh. Back in 2020, we were extremely fortunate to receive an NIH Phase 1 STTR grant. It was a partnership between M&S Biotics and Houston Methodist Hospital, specifically Dr. Kaur and the brilliant staff over at Mighty. And we had gathered a lot of really great preclinical data showing how the technology worked on the benchtop, in a vacuum. Our industry partners loved it, our other partners really liked it, but the next thing that we needed to do was we needed clinical evidence that we could actually use this in an operating room. And just shy of actually putting it in a live OR, we decided to retrofit one of the simulated operating rooms over at Mighty, and we did a series of simulated procedures on human cadavers just to test how exactly our technology worked and fit into the clinical workflow. And so what we did was we had a variety of human cadavers, and we did 13 procedures, and we did a variety of different procedures, vascular to cardiothoracic. We did carotid endarterectomies, we did AAA repairs, we did a total heart transplant, and we had a variety of physicians as well. We had residents, we had attendings, and we even had a chief. And some of the most notable assumptions that we validated by doing this was, one, there absolutely is a place for the biotic system in an operating room. And the second assumption that was validated was about instrument usage. So if you can see from the graph here, over 200 instruments were listed on average on each of the preference cards. And that was all of the instruments that each surgeon said that this is what I need to do this procedure. Well, using our system, we were to actually track the utilization of those instruments. And we were able to show that even though over 200 instruments were requested for each case, less than 50 were actually touched. And this really mirrors a lot of what we saw in the literature, and it's great to have this validation from this simulated clinical workflow. Now, one of the biggest knee-jerk reactions that we always get from docs is, look, if you take my instruments, I'm gonna break your fingers, because they never wanna be without instruments that they might inevitably need. You know, sometimes they're just there for emergencies. Well, I agree with you. I don't wanna take away any instruments that you need. We just wanna reduce the total surgical set. That way you're not processing instruments you won't use. And that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve, because, you know, in the literature, we've seen that up to 7 times per case, people will leave the operating room to go retrieve items. Now, this doesn't really track if these instrument sets are so big and has everything you need, and that just tells me that these sets are full of redundant vestigial items that people don't actually use, and they have too few of the instruments that people need. And what we want to do is bring data-driven insights to why you should reduce preference cards and only give you the instruments that you want to use during your procedure. And the next most important thing that we validated was the actual counting and efficacy of counting actually before and after the case. We wanted to do this in conjunction with our simulated procedures, but due to time and COVID restraints, we unfortunately were not able to. We couldn't take the surgical teams away from their day jobs, but they were kind enough to come back and volunteer for these simulated vacuum studies where we tested how quickly and how accurately they were able to count a few small sets. The way we ran this trial was we had 3 different sets. We had a set with 75 instruments, we had a set with 100 instruments, and a set with 125 instruments. And all we said was, this is your back table, this is your instrument set, please count these in and verify that everything on the preference card is here, just like you would before an actual case. Try and mirror it as closely as you can to the real thing. And we were able to show that even though these brilliant surgical teams were really quick and really accurate at what they were doing, they couldn't beat the machine. And another important thing that we wanted to study was real errors. So in this second trial on the preference card, we said, hey, there's 100 instruments here, but in reality, we only gave them 98. And this is to mimic a real life error in the operating room where sometimes sets arrive and they don't actually have every single item that is listed on the actual preference card. And we were able to show that our system was incredibly accurate and incredibly quick at counting in all these procedures. And I'll say the next knee-jerk reaction that everybody has when they see this is they say, why are you trying to take my job? Well, the short answer is we're not. We're not at all. We are trying to be a tool and an aid for you to help increase the speed and the efficacy by which you can count in sets during and before and after a procedure. You know, Josh tells me all the time, in some ways we are like the Tesla of medical devices, right? So you sit in the driver's seat, you turn on the auto driving function, but you don't get in the back seat and read a book, right? You sit in the driver's seat still, you keep your hands on the wheel, and you kind of ghost the controls, and that's exactly what we envision for this initial rollout. We're not trying to replace anybody here. We're trying to be a tool by which people can just work faster, work easier. And the last most important piece of data that we collected was about usability. So in my short medical device tenure here in the TMC, I've seen tons and tons of medical device innovations created by brilliant clinicians, but sometimes they don't ever ask the end user, hey, do you want to use this? And we ultimately want to build something that people want and people will use, which is why we incorporated usability into our study. And we did really well. We did better than we thought we would. And we got a lot of really great feedback from the end user, and so much good feedback that we were able to actually take a lot of it and incorporate it into our second software rollout that is now included as part of the commercial rollout. That way the end user, that's the surgical team, can actually have the best user experience that was helped designed by surgical teams.
Excellent, Drew. And I'm going to take it from here, and I do want to just piggyback off what you said around instrument utilization and what the availability of instruments will be for the surgeon. And the goal here is optimization as well as reduction. So we are going to take the instruments needed and consolidate that down to one set with a secondary set of instrumentation that's typically used. But we're never going to fully remove stuff. So even the rarely used items could be stationed off in the peel pack, so they're just outside of the operating room when that rare event occurs. The goal is ultimately to optimize, so there's less equipment coming in and you have more of what you need and less of what you don't. And where do we go from there? It's the automated counting and the autonomous tracking that gives us these data analytics. It's these AI-driven insights that lead to these optimized surgical sets. But the last missing piece that we envision coming next is sterile processing and distribution, the SPD department. Surgical set accuracy is another major issue. So ensuring the correct equipment is in the right set, registered for the right operating room is the next step, just to close this circle. And ultimately, what this company is doing is peeling back the curtain to the operating room. We're getting never before seen data analytics from the operating room, and we're taking these data analytics and we're translating it to actionable change. And this is the core focus of this company, is the scale through the analytics we could provide because they're ever evolving. In year one, the focus obviously is on hospital productivity, cost reduction, and of course patient safety. But by year three, what if in tracking instrument utilization we could start understanding surgical technique, and you could understand when the utilization of certain instruments come into effect of this technique versus that technique. And then you could start correlating it with positive patient outcomes. And it's measurable because you can't change what you can't measure. Now we can. Well, there's healthcare deserts in this country where the healthcare I could receive at the Texas Medical Center is vastly different from where I might get in the Midwest. But being able to understand and re-baseline these procedures allows for the golden goose of healthcare and the AAA and of making healthcare more affordable, reducing costs out of the system, more equitable. These people can now have the same access to the best techniques because we're re-baselining what it means to be great. And then by year 5, you could understand that there's a lot of white space opportunity from understanding this information, where you could create these universal standards. You could put just-in-time ordering processes. You can incorporate best practices. You could train the next wave of physicians and surgeons on the most up-to-date means of understanding what makes them great and makes them special. And from the company standpoint, where are we today? We are commercial. So to give you a timeline, just recently this year, is we developed the first minimal viable product, and that is a lot of what the picture showed inside the mighty surgical center of the simulated operating room. And a lot of those MVPs were actually sponsored by Johnson & Johnson to build up those minimal viable products, of which we did that demo for. We now have our 510K exemption, so we are officially cleared to commercialize this product, and we're piloting our first pilot through AT&T in the next 30 days. So we're going live and we're preparing to ensure this technology and this product is in an operating room near you. And ultimately the future, we want to expand the data analytics we could collect, what we could show, how we can measure. And a lot of that is working with institutions like Houston Methodist, where we're getting the top-notch physicians in the country to provide feedback that is ultimately going to translate to a better product downstream. And I would be remiss not to turn this over to Drew, to our first author on this paper, which we all implore you to review after this show, to share a little bit more about himself and his relationship with Houston Methodist.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh. Just a quick shout out to the folks down the road at Texas A&M NMed. I am a medical student at NMed at Houston Methodist Hospital. It's the first dual degree MD, Masters of Engineering program in the country. Our focus is medical innovation, and they lovingly call us physicianeers, which is slowly growing on me. So just a quick shout out, if you're a clinician, you're in any way associated with healthcare and you want to innovate, find the nearest physicianeer and let's make it happen. So thank you very much.
Okay, well listen, I think got any more slides, guys?
That's it.
To team. Okay, so thank you very much for that. I mean, that was a very, very polished presentation there. I think one of my roles here is to dig a little bit deeper, to pull the hood up a little bit and ask some questions. And for full transparency, we were part of that study together. So I was the PI on that NIH STTR grant. And from a personal perspective, you know, we're in the TMC a lot. You get a lot of companies coming up to hospitals saying, hey, I've got the latest and greatest thing. Get a lot of that. So, you know, if I decide I want to work with a company, I really like put it through the test, and I'm sure the guys will say we've had quite a few hard conversations for them trying to convince me that this works, and I've been asking questions again and again, but we've put it through that test, and you know, it does work and it's convincing. But some more questions here. So we've got some from our audience, but I'm going to go back into this. What happens if the RFID tag falls off? And the reason I'm saying that is we have been asked that a lot. And so tell us about the RFID tags themselves and the FDA, etc.
Sure, yeah. And I'm going to just go back to the picture of the tag itself. And I did allude to it, is these are commercially off-the-shelf tags. So many different vendors make them. This is just the tag that we're using. They're a ceramic tag, so they're biocompatible. They're FDA approved for this purpose. They're meant for the sterilization cycles, and all the glues, epoxies are all made to be biocompatible with the patient, and also to ensure that the tag doesn't fall off. And where it's going is actually being embedded at the point of manufacturing, so there is no way for it to, even in the most rare event ever, come off. And it should be noted, just to kind of hammer this point home, our system works within this technology. So these RFID tags are already out there. They're in the field. There's instruments already tagged with them. We are the system that essentially takes this application to what we're trying to do. Traditionally, what you'll see with these RFID tagged instruments is just general inventory management that could be done with an off-the-shelf RFID gun. And we kind of dovetailed it into the operating room to focus on a specific problem and a specific solution. But yeah, that's really the major touch point of this is rare chance that they are biocompatible and they are FDA approved for this purpose.
Okay. And I know you touched on this earlier, but you're talking about breaking surgical fingers, or they will break your fingers if you try and take instruments away from them. But what do you do about those rarely used items, those instruments that don't really get a lot of use, but they need them there? Like, how are you going to get around that, and what's the plan there?
Yeah, so to kind of answer that is that's the genius around the algorithms we're deploying, is it's not just tracking, is it used or is it not used? It's also understanding the frequency of use. So if you have instruments that I like to refer to as high velocity, so hemostats that are used in all procedures, well, those high use items are going to be conserved in all sets. They'll always be present in multiple quantities. But when you start getting to items that have less velocity, well, therefore the redundancy of those items, so some might have 8, 10, you could start paring that down because the velocity of use isn't there. And again, it's worth mentioning, you don't know this because you're not measuring it. It's qualitative. A lot of people, you could ask any surgeon, hey, how many instruments do you typically use on a case? They likely say, I only ever use 15 to 20. Rare event, I might use this one. So actually measuring that kind of peels back the curtain a little bit to say, hey, this is what's actually used and here's what's sometimes used. So you start consolidating that down into the sets. So I like to say on average 75 instruments per set is kind of the standard. It's not the gold standard, not all the time, but roughly. So you imagine 4 sets for 300 instruments. If you could reduce that by 50% of high use items in one set, middle use items in one set, an available set outside the operating room of rarely used items, and then the ones that almost never are used or in peel packs, we actually never take anything away, but we're not breaking the sterilization protocol on these sets, so they could actually be used for future cases and never actually brought into the operating room. And that's kind of where we're going with it. So we're never taking them away. We're actually making more of what you need easily, more easily accessible versus the ones that you don't, that you likely wouldn't even know are missing in the first place.
Now, M&S Biorix, like, you guys aren't the only company kind of looking into this kind of area, and I know there's some image tracking solutions out there. So would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, and that's one of the cool things. I shouldn't say cool, but a big company that we're working with is AT&T, and also J&J. They look into all technologies, independent and unbiasedly. So we're working them on an unbiased basis, and some of the image recognition technology is good, but I like to say it's kind of more for like macro items, bigger things to track. But when you get down to individual instruments, and I'd like to go to a picture like this, maybe not that one, but when these instruments like this are in really, really close proximity, you can't see the ending needle of a hemostat that's curved. And a lot of this image recognition technology works when you can create that separation. And the value of RFID technology just in general is it's non-optical. It could be seen, you could track stuff, you could see sponges inside the patient without actually having to visualizing, which essentially defeats the purpose of image-guided technology is, you need to see it. Well, what if you can't? So that's where RFID is really edging out image recognition technology. Now, I'm not saying there's not a place for it. You could see a lot of it with just general asset management, but when you get down to large volumes in close proximity, it kind of fails the litmus test in a lot of circumstances. And that's not my own opinions. That's just some of the feedback we've seen from our major partners when they investigated this technology.
Yeah, and I think, like going into them as tracking options out there, I mean, we've actually seen that here at Houston Methodist. We've got a great video production team here, and they're usually in the OR or over at Mighty doing recordings, they're recording procedures. They're constantly moving around and changing their field of view to capture what's going on. Because why? The surgeons are blocking that field of view. So a lot of this image tracking solution stuff, it can just fall apart because the view is getting blocked, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's one big question, and this is actually one of the reasons that I really love working with M&S Biorx over the last few years. Anecdotally, I was speaking to Chief Operating Officer of one of the major hospitals here in the TMC a few years ago, and he gave me a question. He said, "Hey, Stuart, how do you change surgical behavior?" And I really thought about it, and you start thinking about financial incentives, RVUs, etc. And he just looked at me and said, "No, competition." And it was like a light bulb that went off my head. I thought, yeah, if you're getting surgeons competing a little bit, you can make big changes here. And that always stuck with me, and I always thought whenever I evaluated technology, I think, well, can this change surgical behavior? I think with this system it can, because you're looking at this data. You can look at your procedure and say, okay, that took me 1 hour, I used 50 instruments. But what if you compare it to what they're doing across the road or at another hospital, right? The same procedure. Well, hang on, this person's doing it in 30 minutes and he's using half the number of instruments. You're going to want to understand what it is about your technique that is, I guess, inferior to that other person. So that's going to start driving this healthy competition,
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I'd be remiss not to say there's many surgeons, and I will plug that I would say close to 50 to 60% of our investors are physicians and surgeons themselves. So this company really was brought about because of the TMC ecosystem and given life, really. But I've always had surgeons say is, would I have visibility into what my colleagues are using? Because they're fundamentally trained differently. We went to different med schools, we rotated at different hospitals, and my residency was here and they were there, and I know they do something different. Is what I learned better, equivalent, worse? And not just from, you can look at the patient side of it, but at the end of the day, nobody goes through the, Drew, I'm sure you could speak to this, the rigorous training it takes to get to that level without a degree of competition, without a degree of wanting to be the best you can be at your craft, and having, data-driven insights to make you better is likely to be received well. And maybe you could, explain, from yourself how you might view about that.
Well, from my standpoint, the first thing that comes to mind is if you can all of a sudden correlate instrument usage with technique and all of a sudden with patient outcomes, then you can say that surgeon A over here, they have better outcomes with their technique versus surgeon B across the road, because we have that data to show you. And that's one of the biggest things that I'm starting to learn about medicine and surgery, is that we don't really know. We still have yet to generate that data, and that's really what we're trying to do.
So just keep in mind, Drew is a second year NMed student. So we'll put the RFID tags on you, and then you're going to start seeing your own data and go, oh no, what do I need to do better here? So we're going to take some questions from our audience. This is a really good one. It's saying, if we rely too much on the automatic system, what do we do if it goes wrong? Does a manual double check, is that needed, a manual double check?
I think you gave the Tesla analogy, Drew. Do you want to, and you did it well. Do you want to just explain what goes into that process.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So right now, if you're unfamiliar, as I understand it, a surgical team, they'll prep the case, they'll get the preference card that they need for that specific case, they'll get all of that instrumentation, and then they'll start breaking up those instrument sets, and they'll start laying them out on the table. They'll start correlating it with the actual preference card. They got to count. Do I have this many clamps? Yeah. Okay. Do I have this many knife handles? Okay. But what if the card says, oh, there should be 6 and I only have 5? Well, then you got to go back, you start over and you start counting again. And I mean, it's really just a time-intensive process. So if you were to have a system where you could bust everything out, put it on the table, be like, bam, I have the 80 I was supposed to have, we're good to go. Yes, that's great. But again, it is, like Josh was saying, like the Tesla, you are still ghosting the controls. So at the end of the day, you still need to verify, you still need to double check, but we're just trying to make that double checking process just a little bit more efficient.
And I like to just add is that ultimately some of the biggest drawbacks is around reconciliation for this stuff. And ultimately, just like a Tesla, your dependency on it will always be there. But at the end of the day, there should always be a human at the controls who are verifying that even though the table is registering showing 80, it will expedite that counting process.
I have another question here. So what was the hardest thing so far on your journey? And I guess this fits in nicely to the TMC medical innovation ecosystem as a whole, right? Because I've been here for a few years. And
I mean, it's one of those things of how much time do we have? It was all hard. I came out of college as a background in bioengineering. I didn't know what an angel investor was when I wanted to go after this problem. And I grew up in an area, in northeastern Pennsylvania that just doesn't have the resources like you can get in Houston. And it wasn't until I moved to Houston to participate in TMCX that I got that counseling, that I met rock stars like Dr. Stuart Core to give me unbiased feedback and honest answers and give me the guidance to kind of get to where it has to go. And we're solving a really, really, really big problem, and a lot of the stuff that goes into it isn't necessarily fully under our control. And because of that, it could be scary in a sense, but all good things and good changes are scary at first. And that's it's constantly hard. But it's been enjoyable to kind of get to this point from the original proof of concept that I put in front of Dr. Core's eyes the first time he met me, all the way now to a commercial product where it's working and will be working in live operating rooms right around the corner. That's my feedback.
All right. Well, on that, I think actually one more thing. We were talking earlier before we went on air, and we had that really nice anecdote about we'd put the body in the CT scanner. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's right. So I very distinctly remember we had done a couple cases at this point, and it was a Friday afternoon. Everybody was packing up to go home for the evening, and all the sets were put away. Everything was back on the back table. The patient was closed up, and I left the system running. And we went to go close it out, and I very distinctly remember that there was still one instrument that was outstanding. And we were losing our minds. We were running around the operating room for an hour. We were looking at all the nooks and crannies, seeing if we knocked something on the floor, kicked it under a table, and we couldn't find it. And then finally we were just like, you know what, there's an error, there's a bug in the system, let's just go home. Well, sure enough, the patient was put into an imaging modality a little bit later the next week, and sure enough, a clamp lit up like a Christmas tree. And that just goes to show you that even in these simulated cases, there was a retained surgical instrument. So it does happen, as infrequently as it might.
I think that's a really nice way to end this. So I'd just like to thank again my guests, Drew and Josh. Thanks for having you guys on the show. And I think we're going to have another episode come up in a couple of months, so stay tuned, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.